Professor Van Cleve, my fellow Group 2 members, and the millions watching around the world. Welcome to my inaugural YouTube video, the first and possibly last in my attempt at internet fame. My name is Tucker Esler, and I am here to discuss the sources of my final paper, the argument I will make in my paper, and finally the million-dollar question: was the American Revolution in fact revolutionary? Let us begin with my first source. It is titled "A Planter's Daughter in South Carolina During the American Revolution." This is an account of the war as told by a plantation owner's widow in a series of letters to her friend. In these letters, she describes the atrocities made by the British during the war and how they plundered her parents' and eventually sisters' plantations during the siege on South Carolina. Next is a speech from William H. Drayton to the Cherokee Nation, in which he lists the grievances against the British and attempts to convince the Native Americans to fight on the side of the American colonists. Despite the promises made in this speech, most of the Native Americans would not see much change aside from being a sovereign nation under the new United States of America. Next, we move on to a document referencing the Albany Committee of Correspondence in 1775, in which the British Indian Superintendent, Colonel Guy Johnson, spoke about an attack on British soldiers made by New Englanders, in which the natives in the area remained neutral. As we know, once the fighting commenced, there were native tribes on both sides, each trying to hold out hope that their side would be victorious and they would be granted greater position due to their dedication. Sadly, this was not the case. Next, we move on to a document that is the telling of a story narrated by an African-American slave that served during the 7 Years' War, was sold to a Connecticut plantation, and then served in the American Revolution on the side of the Americans. At the end of his service, he was granted emancipation, but he still lived out the rest of his days as a second-rate citizen, being an African-American. Next is on the opposite side of that for African Americans, which is recruiting of African Americans into the Continental Army. This is a series of documents that led to the end of African American recruits to the Continental Army and the subsequent abolishing of this order that would allow different militias to recruit the African Americans. This began to be allowed because the African Americans outnumbered the whites in these areas and could be of greater service to them if they were allowed to escape and join on the side of the British. Next, we get back to Native Americans in a book titled "Native Americans in the American Revolution: How the War Divided, Devastated, and Transformed the Early American Indian World." This book details the many different tribes and their involvement in the early days of America. It pays special attention to the American Revolution and its great impact on the Native Americans during and after the conflict. Next is a pamphlet that we are all very aware of in this class, and that is "Common Sense" by Thomas Paine. This is the pamphlet that was distributed throughout America, which got many of the American people on board the idea of revolution. Unfortunately, the liberties discussed in this pamphlet were not promised for all, and as a result, many were left in the same position of inferiority. Moving lastly to my final source is titled "Woman's Dilemma" by Rosemary Zagari. This is a book that tells the story of Mercy Otis Warren and her many accomplishments and contributions to the American Revolution. Despite her standing during the war effort, she would remain at the status of property after the war due to her gender. Now, with these sources, I will make the argument that the social status quo was largely unaffected by the American Revolution, and therefore the American Revolution, despite its political importance, was in fact not that revolutionary. So thank you for watching, and be sure to look for my next video, "Why Wasn't the Civil War All That Civil?"